thank you for joining today's CHM seminar. It's my great honor to introduce Professor Sven Nyholm. Sven is Professor of the Ethics of Artificial Intelligence at the Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich. He's also a principal investigator in the Munich Center for Machine Learning and a member of the Ethical Advisory Board of the Human Brain Project, which is one of the biggest neuroscience projects in the world, and also an associate editor of the journal Science and Engineering Ethics. So Sven's work provides philosophical insight into broad topics related to ethics of new technology, including the moral dilemmas of several self-driving cars and the human-robot relationships. As AI ethics is also one of the major research topics here at CHM. I think many of you are already very familiar with his research. I personally, as a cognitive neuroscience, I enjoy reading his discussion on deep brain stimulation and the true self. It was very thought-provoking. And today, I think Sven will talk about the ethics of accident algorithms for autonomous vehicles. And although it's tempting to draw an analogy between the moral dilemma faced by the crashing self-driving cars and the famous philosophical thought experiment Trolley Problem, Sven has heard a critical view of this. I'm very excited to hear more about this through this talk. And so the talk will be around 45 minutes, followed by 30 minutes of discussion. And I think Sven's flexible with the questions. But I think it's better if you have clarification questions, you can ask during the talk. Otherwise, you can save the questions in the end. So without further ado, let's welcome Professor Sven Nyholm.
Thanks a lot for the invitation. I get to be here. If the people online cannot hear me, please make some sort of sign or turn on your mic and let me know. But I think this is muted, and so I wouldn't know if I could then hear you. But so far, no one. Okay, so thanks a lot, Kelly, and that's working. Yeah, so self-driving cars and the trolley problem. And so you may know that the idea of self-driving cars is not. And I mean, now it's no longer discussed quite as much as it used to be, but the picture there on the left side is, I think it's from the 1930s. So already there was a dream that there would be a future of self-driving cars. And so, this on the right side is more recent depiction of self-driving cars. But it's just to say that this is a kind of long-standing dream, at least for some engineers. And so, even though philosophical and psychological and other discussions are recent, I mean, the idea is old. And okay. So I'm going to start with well, I just said something historical. I talked about the idea of the self-driving cars in the 30s, but more recent research was fairly theoretical before 2015. There was already some road testing with autonomous vehicles, but it really started becoming much more widespread about around not quite 10 years ago, but something like that. And around the same time, lawyers and then later philosophers, behavioral economists, psychologists, lots of people started thinking about what could happen if there's an accident and what if someone is harmed or injured. And really, before 2015, it was all hypothetical. It was thought experiments. And so, what if someone what if there's a crash, there's harm? For example, should we be responsible, or should the car? How should it react to those kinds of circumstances? But then, and this was around the time that I myself started thinking about this, and it was quite interesting to kind of follow real world developments, because in 2015 there were about 20 minor crashes involving self-driving cars. Now, at that point in time, it was mostly people driving regular cars who drove into the rear end of self-driving cars because they were, they were not sort of behaving like human-driven cars do. They were braking and accelerating in a much slower, gentle way, and people would expect them to behave differently. So the humans were always good. However, Valentine's Day 2016, there was a case, the first case, as far as I know, where the self-driving car is thought to have caused the problems. A Google car in, I think it's Mountain View, California, they're testing lots of Google cars. A bus was coming in from a bus stop, and the Google car thought that the bus would yield to it, so to speak, but the bus driver thought that, like most people, the car would let the bus go in first, and so that the two collided. Nothing really bad happened. There was some minor scratches on the self-driving car, but what was interesting about it was on this occasion, Google said, okay, it's partly our fault. They didn't say it's completely their fault, but it's partly their fault. So now we have self-driving cars crashing with regular vehicles, and it's the self-driving car's fault. Interesting from a point of view, those of us were already thinking about this as a hypothetical situation. A little bit later, same year, actually in May, but it didn't sort of get out to the general public until June. For the first time, someone sitting in a self-driving car dying with a self-driving car, in this case, a Tesla operating in autopilot mode, crashed into a truck. And so there was a white truck, a big one, and there was blue sky. And apparently there was a sort of, I guess the self-driving car thought maybe it was a cloud or something like that, a white thing on the blue surface. But so it just ran straight into this truck, and the person in the car basically died immediately. 2018 is the first time where a person outside a self-driving car is hit and killed. So in Harrisburg was crossing the road in Tempe, Arizona. Here too, there was a similar problem. The AI in the car first classified her as a road sign, then as a bike. I think she was walking with a bike, and then as a vehicle or an unknown object. And sort of jumping back and forth between different classifications and didn't act in time, and so it straight into this person who then died. Okay, now I'm saying this just because we are going to talk about hypothetical thought experiments and imagined cases, but it's just good to keep in mind that self-driving cars, and I'm going to say something about what I mean by self-driving cars in a second, they do, well, experiments. Self-driving cars are out in traffic, causing harm, and so there are people whose lives are ended or put at risk, etc., etc. And so it's even though some of the cases can be fantastic and some of them are humorous, we should take this seriously because it is a matter of life and death. So let's see. Just by way of just contextualizing it and setting the right real world setting in the right. So okay, so I'm going to talk about the ethics of self-driving cars. So I work in the philosophy department, and as I was introduced, I'm a professor of ethics, and so I think about this from a philosophical, ethical point of view. But I also try to follow the discussion of this in other fields, and also try to follow the technical development. And these days you hear much less about self-driving cars, but the time when I started working on this, every day there's a new story about a crashed self-driving car or a new breakthrough in the technology, etc. So, and very early on, it was suggested that this is actually a little bit like what philosophers call the trolley problem. Well, I mean, this is part of the question. Is it really like a trolley problem? And I started writing about that quite early. So actually, I think what inspired me to look at this was there was a press release about the moral machine experiment. The first paper, which is about, people want other people to have harm minimizing cars, but they want their own self-driving car, just always prioritize them. You see the nature of science. The science and the science or someone else sent out a press release, and then so I was contacted by, I was working in the Netherlands, the Dutch press had heard about this. We need an expert to say, is it really like a trolley problem? So I thought, okay, well, take it upon myself to think about that. And they also seem to be, so there have been a lot of comparisons in the popular press, and as we will see later, some philosophers have talked about this, etc., etc. So it was just obvious that someone would have to write an article saying, well, is it really like a trolley problem? And I never set out to show that it wasn't. My this was a, let's think about this. And so then I kept thinking about that because since I had written about this early, I sort of followed the discussion. So from a zoomed out point of view, I think there are basically three main discussions that have arisen within that larger topic about whether this is a real life problem. So that's what I'm going to talk about. And I think that this also raises what you might call a kind of methodological question, like when we think about new technology and ethics, what exactly should we be doing? Are there certain things we shouldn't be doing? I heard an anecdote before we started about people accusing each other, having blood on their hands because talking about the trolley problem is apparently very dangerous. And so that was a clear expression of view that one shouldn't be talking about this. Okay. Now, as I said, I first published on this in 2016, and then early this year I wrote an article, which is basically this presentation today, where I thought that I was summing up a discussion that was, in a certain sense, over and done with, because people had been discussing is the comparison between the trolley problem and self-driving cars, is that a good idea? People have been writing about that since around 2015 and 16 and around that time. And so I thought, okay, now is a good time to kind of see, okay, where did the discussion go and what did we learn? But people are still publishing about this just this year. 2 new philosophy papers came out about this, and these are the Philosophical Quarterly and Utilitas are both really good philosophy journals. So the topic is being further discussed and taken quite seriously in this very good venues. So it apparently is not the discussion that's over, it's ongoing. Okay. I mentioned the word self-driving cars. I was going to say what I mean by it. And when people talk about that, they often talk about this sort of scale between fully self-driving, fully automated level 5 cars, on one hand, still considered unrealistic in real-world traffic. And then sort of old school level 0 cars on the other end of the extreme, meaning that you have to do absolutely everything. You have to brake, you have to steer, you have to do this, you have to do that. For me, and then in the middle of the scale in their part that you can turn on automation so that for the moment the car drives itself, but you have to maybe take over in certain scenarios, or the car doesn't claim to be able to operate in certain types of traffic. For me, when I talk about self-driving car, it's a car that at some point or other is able to drive by itself, whether or not you sometimes have to take over, whether or not it can drive by itself in all traffic scenarios. In a certain sense, it doesn't matter, I think, to this issue about what could happen in accident scenarios. It could be that a level 3 car is in a risky scenario, and the question is, what should and shouldn't happen. And so, in a certain sense, for me, it doesn't really matter whether level 5 cars are unrealistic from the current point of view. You could still ask the question about how should the technology interact with other participants in traffic, whether it's a person on a bike, whether it's a pedestrian, whether it's another automatic car, whether it's a regular car, train, whatever it might be. So I think that we shouldn't say that if level 5 cars are unrealistic, then there's no point in discussing this, because you could still have cars that are operating some of the time in autonomous mode. And that we already have. So that's another way in which this, I think, is a real world issue. Okay, so jumping back and forth a little bit in the chronology. And I said at one point in the beginning of my remarks that these days people maybe talk about this a little bit less, and but it's a trend to them. Journals publishing articles about this, and every now and then you hear about cars research. But around 2015, there was really a lot of interest, and one TED talk that I still recommend, it's kind of interesting, especially from our point of view today, is Chris Armstrong, who's, he's now no longer He's still involved with one of the self-driving car companies or startups, but not Google. But by then he was the head of the Google smart car or Google car program. And in this TED talk, he's saying that first of all, we need fully self-driving cars, and we need them now. He ends the talk by saying that when my two children reach the age of getting driver's license, they shouldn't be able to get driver's license because there should only be self-driving cars available. So from his point of view, it's urgent and we need them now. And why? Because they're safer, they're better, they have all sorts of good features, but most of all, they would save lives because they could do what humans can't do. And in order to illustrate this, in this TED talk, he talks about scenarios that the experimental Google cars have faced in real world traffic that were extremely unexpected, but still the Google car was able to deal with it. So one scenario that he describes as the self-driving car comes on the road, and then there's a lady in an electronic wheelchair who's chasing a bunch of ducks around in a circle. And he brings this up as an example of that the crazy sort of thing that could happen in traffic and does happen. And the self-driving car was able to safely handle this very unusual scenario. And so then he also talks about different there's suddenly a bicycle appears on the road from the wrong direction on a red light, etc. And this the self-driving car safely handles it, and so on and so forth. So the idea is that you throw any kind of strange scenario at us, and self-driving cars are going to be able to handle that. And he said, has a track record of doing so. I mentioned this talk a little bit for a long time because we're going to get back to him saying that we should think about this unusual scenarios a bit later. Okay, so that's Chris Urmson. Now, around that time is also when I guess the war machine experiment was starting up. I'm not sure exactly what the exact timeline is, but definitely I think when I got that press release sent, I think that's 2015, and then the first major argument was probably 2015 and then 16, because you also had like a shorter
2015,
yeah, and then it became the science article, and then later the big major one. But anyway, but that's where we are in the timeline. And then, well, I'm assuming that people in this room are familiar with this. It's still up and running. I teach AI ethics. I usually show people, the game or whatever you want to call it, and people love it. How many iterations do you go through? Like, is it 20 or something like that? 13. Yeah. And so if you do this with students, you show them some of these dilemmas, and then you are sort of like at the 12th or something like that, and you say, well, they always say, let's go to the very end and stuff. It's sort of an eternal hit in terms of people really like this. And again, you will know about this, but you have things that's okay, there's a red light, people are crossing. If the car goes straight, then you will take out these people crossing the red light, and then if you don't, then the people in the car will have to suffer. Sometimes notice that they are crossing on the green light here. The dogs, the cats, whatever it is. And so watch it. That's right. This is a German. Yeah, and there's all the variations, and if I remember correctly, you can also come up with your own variations. And I actually never tried this. I should try this. I hope this more was intended for me. So anyway, so the point of all this is to see what kind of attitudes people have, like what should a self-driving car do, But I'll ask you questions every now and then, because of course, it's hundreds of millions of responses have been collected. And so that means that there are at least millions of users that have gone through this.
So till today, it's over 100 billion and 10 million users.
That's right, and that has to be a record. Sorry, I don't know so much about that compared. We discussed it before, but it seems to me that probably there are not very many. Because I've done a little bit of empirical research myself. Maybe we had 200 participants. So I was like, wow, we have so many participants. But anyway, so lots of interesting findings, as we all probably know. I already mentioned one. People tend to think that other people should have Utilitarian self-driving cars that should minimize harm, maximize overall happiness. But we ourselves want to have a sort of what some people call an egoistic car, should save us costs. And then, of course, there are, I mean, I mentioned this, the green and the red light, because there seems to be a little bit of a cultural difference in terms of whether people think that that matters at all. And, you know, should we prioritize the young or the old, etc. So lots of really interesting findings from all of this, several responses that we collected. As I said, people had already before them made. And so if you're a philosopher, you would think that this looks a little like the trolley problem. And indeed, people had already before them started talking about this. So here, this is from 2009 already. So could the trolley cases be one of the first frontiers for artificial morality? Driving assistance put machines in the position of making split-second decisions that could have life and death implications. And so the more complex, the more trolley cases would come up. Already in 2009. I think one of them is a computer scientist, if I remember correctly, the other one is a philosopher. Here we have another philosopher. One of the most iconic thought experiments in ethics, the trolley problem, is about to become a real-life issue. And so here's also a quote from the early short paper by the More Machine team. It's a situation of unavoidable harms, as illustrated in our examples. There, a striking resemblance to the trolley problem. And so, as I said, around that time, it seemed to me that someone has to step forward and say, yes, obviously, superficially, you can come up with a scenario where like there's one person in the car, 5 people, and you have to make a choice. But what if we think about it in more detail? Should we be careful to some extent about making this comparison? Now, it wasn't only philosophers and people like me who thought about that, but there was sort of an ongoing discussion in the media. And so here are some headlines where you can tell there's almost like a story where there's first enthusiasm, and then after a while, reports starting to come out that people in the industry and elsewhere are starting to get skeptical and frustrated with this. So here's a little bit of a story. The driverless, these are our headlines. The driverless cars are colliding with the trolley problem, 2015. Mercedes plans to let its self-driving car kill pedestrians, 2016. Google's chief of self-driving cars downplays the trolley problems. This was the guy who 1 year before said that in any situation, our self-driving car can handle it. Now we say that, the self-driving cars and the trolley, that kind of situation not going to happen very often. So let's not think too much about those. MIT study exports the trolley problem in self-driving cars, 2018. Should the self-driving car kill your baby or your grandmother? Depends on where you're from. Millions of people have taken the More Machine experiment test, and then people are starting to worry about this in the industry to say, don't let trolley dilemmas influence policies about self-driving cars, is what experts are saying. So this is the fact how this sort of, if you just look at the headlines, you can see kind of excitement, and then some people starting to get skeptical. But we also see, as one of the headlines shows, that obviously there are interesting findings. Okay, but what during the same sort of period of time, how did academics, and I'm now mostly going to focus on people such as myself, philosophers talking about this, and so the question that I and some others asked, and there have been actually quite a few articles about this, is this like a trolley problem? It's like sort of the applied real world version of the trolley problem. Well, when one thinks about this, of course, one thing one should ask oneself is, okay, what exactly is the trolley problem? But there's one thing to say, there's a superficial, obvious similarity between the two things, and on the one hand, and second, when people talk about the trolley, are they talking about something quite different or something similar to what we talk about when we talk about this action self-driving cars? Okay, so I just want to pay tribute to the founding mothers of the trolley problem. So you sometimes when they teach philosophy courses, when we talk about the trolley problems, students are slightly shocked to hear that these nice-looking ladies who came up with these examples. And so Philippa Putt was sort of the one on the left, was the one that first came up with something that looks a lot like the trolley problem, but then Julie Thompson was the one who sort of came up with the case that everyone discusses. That's just slightly tweaked the original case of Philippa Putt. And I think that she also came up with the name the trolley problem. So Ludwig Thompson sort of built on Philippa Foot's discussion about the following cases, and they will be familiar to you, I think. So the train is coming towards the 5. You're standing there by this switch, and so if you pull the switch, the train goes the other way, but then it's one person. So should you sacrifice the 1 in order to save the 5? And here most people, and I always do this in intro to ethics, people always say, well, not everyone, but most people say it's permissible. You may do it. You don't have to, but maybe you should, but you don't. It's certainly permissible. The other variations is there's a large and heavy object, happens to be a person, on the bridge, and you are thin and not very heavy, but you know about trains, and you know that if a large, heavy object is in the path of the train, the automatic brakes will be set off. The object might be crushed and destroyed, but the 5 in this particular case will be saved. Here, most people say you shouldn't do it. It would be wrong to do it. So here, you should not save the 5 by sacrificing 1. And so these are the 2 most often discussed cases. And so when philosophers talk about the trolley problem, they often say that well, now we can't read this, but well, I'll just tell you what it says. You can look there if you want to see the text. I mean, it's just that, what's the difference between these cases that on the one hand sort of explains why people make different judgments, and then on the other hand also sort of justifies or rationalizes those differences. It's often assumed in philosophical discussion about this that it's correct to say that there's a difference. And so, and that means people say that the right principle of morality can just be minimize harm. Because if you minimize harm, in both cases, if you sacrifice with 1, but people think that you shouldn't sacrifice what used to be called a fat man, now we should call a large and heavy person. So there has to be some other moral principle there that makes a difference. And if you're not familiar with it and you want to read like a sort of philosophical book about this, I would really recommend Frances Camp's book, The Trolley Problem Mysteries, because she takes this case and sort of changes the edge slightly. Suddenly, the guy swearing perhaps doesn't make a difference. Now it's a convicted criminal, maybe that makes a difference. It's just really just tweaks all the little parameters, so to speak, and trying to kind of articulate, what's the difference between all these cases. And the way that she puts things is something like, why is it sometimes permissible to kill a small number of people in order to save a greater number of people in certain ways, whereas it's sometimes not permissible to kill certain, small number in certain other ways to save the bigger number. That's how she understands problems. Yes.
Can I just ask a really quick question?
Absolutely.
Because you mentioned it. So does it make a difference whether you refer to this person as a fat man or a large person?
Well, that might be one of the things that could be making at least a kind of psychological difference. So, I mean, back in the day, so Judy Thompson, this lady on the right, she called it the fat man. But now I think, I actually think that Cameron Dictionary said that when we think about this, and this is relevant to this in comparison to self-driving cars, actually, we should try to neutralize the people. So it should just be 1 person against 5. And then here it has to be a heavy person so that the example works. But it's a typical feature of this case is that it's supposed to be, should you save 5 by sacrificing 1? And then the question, what means does it take? Can you push them onto a train? Or can you redirect the trolley, etc.? So that's supposed to be the thing that matters. Yes.
Yeah, just to add to that, so I know that psychologists have deconfounded that in all kinds of ways, and the difference remains even if, so as long as like sacrificing the 1 is kind of a causal means of saving the others, the difference persists. So even if you take pushing away, even if you take being heavy away and so on.
Yes, so sometimes there's a trap door and you press a button and he falls down, but yes.
He's got a big backpack.
Backpack, that's another one, right, yeah. So I'm sticking to the classics, like this is what we got from Judy Thompson. Anyway, but like the backpack and all of that stuff, if you're into this sort of thing, then this is a good book because Frances Cam, we were talking about this before the session in a meeting. She had like an abnormal brain, so she can really concentrate on all these small variations and have a clear intuition about them. When I read the book, I lost my way quite quickly. Anyway, but this is what philosophers call the trolley problem. Like, why is it sometimes okay, and we're taking seriously the intuition that it is to kill, the one, to save the five. Why is it not okay on other occasions, and what's the relevant difference? Okay, that's what's meant by the trolley problem. And so the paper that I mentioned that I recently written is part of a whole book that sort of tries to summarize the debate, but as we've seen, the debate is not just about separate, but trolley in general, and so it continues. Okay, now, I said that since around 2015, people have thought about this, both the criticism, but also sometimes positively. And the question is then, what kinds of, if you can zoom out a little bit, like what has the discussion been about? And it seems to me that there are three main debates that have been had, that during these discussions have kind of been, they've been sort of tied together into one big discussion, but you can sort of analyze them speaking about three different things. And the first sort of discussion that seems to be ongoing in parallel with the others is there something sort of insensitive about the whole discussion? And is it perhaps even unethical to talk about the whole issue? And again, we were talking beforehand about people thinking that you're actually causing real world harm by discussing this. The philosopher Luciano Florida thinks, for example. And I learned that he thinks that the moral machine research group, they have blood on their hands because they're making people worry about self-driving cars, by misleading them with trolley problems. So he would be one of those people who think that there's something unethical about even discussing this. However, one of the arguments, I think in that early 2015 short paper, but then also some of the other work, is that you would want AI of different kinds to sort of fit with ordinary people's moral intuitions, and that they're going to accept it much more if these technologies work and sort of fits with or harmonizes with what people find morally acceptable. And so that would be one justification for sort of testing people's intuitions and doing this large experiment. And so for both philosophers to philosophize about this and for empirical researchers to really try to find out what do people think. And I actually haven't read yet, but well, hiding behind this science, this book that then as a Bonfont wrote about the whole story, and I was looking at it today, and well, you probably read it, but I think I need to put this in reading this, because I mean it's been criticized in all sorts of different ways, both academically, but also like a lot of polarization. And one example of someone who was very polarized against this is the philosopher John Harris, who thinks that there's something sort of, and I see that those slides are sort of answers, so I wonder what that's all about, but anyway, I'll focus on the presentation. Now, he thinks that there's something unethical about showing people these pictures, these cartoons with cats crossing a green light or grandmothers crossing on a red light, etc., and making people respond to this, because he thinks it doesn't take seriously enough the life and death decisions that have to be made. And so this is part of what I said in the beginning of the presentation, that there are people dying in traffic, so this is not all the game. But so the question is, how do we think about this when we do research? And according to people like Harris, we shouldn't let people make, express their preferences about trolley problems by scenarios, because that doesn't take seriously enough life and death. The philosopher Farah Naimi also thinks that there's something overly what she calls utilitarian about this discussion. It's all about numbers, it's about quantities. It forgets about other aspects of ethics, such as how can I respect my fellow citizens, how do I sort of interact with other people in a way that shows respect for their human dignity, etc., etc. So she thinks that some of those aspects are left out. Now, there are more general discussions in philosophy about the trolley problem and about whether there's something ethically problematic about that. There was an article by Adam Wood in 2011, for example, that brought this up very nicely. So it's more of a broader discussion about whether this whole methodology of thinking about the trolley problem is somehow insensitive to sort of life and death. Okay, debate or dispute number 2. if you look at the cases, and I said that it's quite easy to come up with sort of superficially similar examples, like involving trolleys on one hand or self-driving cars in the real world on the other hand. But are there maybe important differences? And so that was one of the things that I and my co-authors, Nina Smits, were interested in, and also a guy called Noah Goodall. And one of the things that we focused on was that in discussions about the trolley problem, it's usually assumed that we know that if you push a large person, then the 5 will be saved. If you pull a switch, then we can save the 5. But when we think about how self-driving cars should behave in traffic, we have to think in terms of what could happen with a certain probability where we don't know what's going to happen. So some philosophers working on the ethics of risk, for example, there's a Swedish philosopher called Hansen, who is sort of a big figure in that team. They claim that when it comes to decisions about uncertain and risky scenarios, we actually need different kinds of ethical principles than when we make decisions about known and stipulated facts. And so that is one reason why you might think that, because in the trolley problem, you also assume exactly what's going to happen, and then the question is just what should you do? But if you change that to it's likely that you save the 5 if you push a large person, perhaps you need slightly different ethical principles. Another thing, so that if you teach one of these courses and you ask students, what should I push a large person or not? There's always one student who raises their hand and says, well, am I not going to go to jail? Am I not going to be late? Am I responsible? And then I and other philosophy teachers will say, but it's a thought experiment. Forget about that. Just think about the case, and the question is, what should you do? But when you think about self-driving cars crashing in the real world, issues about legal and moral responsibility are going to be actually basically the first thing that people think about and do think about. All of those cases that I started with, they've all been discussed under the heading of who should be punished, who should pay, who's liable. And so this is just something that is usually abstracted away or assumed not to be relevant in the trolley problem, but in the real world, that is very relevant. Now, some people also say, like, for example, Jonas Himmelreich or Rebecca Davenall, actually there are going to be very few, if any, real world trolley-like scenarios. So actually, we're sort of wasting our time by thinking about the trolley problem. Now, what about the other side of this dispute? Jeff Keeling, for example, has written a very interesting paper defending comparing the trolley problem with self-driving cars. He says that, yeah, it's right. It's not going to happen very often. It's going to be rare, and it's not necessarily realistic. But that doesn't matter because thought experiments are not meant to be realistic. It's like in a lot of sciences have thought experiments that are meant to illustrate some general principle, and then we can reason our way back to the real world based on idealizations. And that's how we think about the trolley problem. And that's also how we think about self-driving cars and trolley problem-like scenarios. It's a thought experiment that's supposed to illustrate something that we can bring back to the real world. So it doesn't matter if there's not a good match between the real world and self-driving cars in trolley-like scenarios. Okay, so last dispute that I'm going to say something about, and this one is very similar to the former one, but this is about when the academic literature about the trolley problem, again going back to Foot and Cam, etc., have they discussed things that are actually relevant to self-driving cars in crashing accident scenarios? And that was another thing that I was arguing in one of my early papers, that, well, again, something like responsibility, which is so important when it comes to technology in the real world, is just not a topic in the discussion about the trolley problem. And that's not necessarily a problem with the discussion about the trolley problem because it's about a different issue. It's about why people have moral intuitions and what would justify that when it comes to the saving lives, etc. But when we think about something like, I don't know, ethical policies or legislation, regulations about self-driving cars, then you sort of have to think about responsibility. And so this is another article by Antti Koponen, a Finnish author that also discusses this in an interesting sort of way. But here too, I should mention that there are others, for example, Hubner and White, who are actually, if you go back to some of the really early discussions by Philippa Foot and Thompson, they do discuss a lot of other things, such as distinctions between what they call negative and positive duties, and also moral differences between people who are involved and people who are not involved in a scenario, whether that makes a difference to what happened to them. And so while they say, I might be right that yes, people it's important to think about things like responsibility, and in the trolley problem literature, people don't discuss that. True. However, there are other things that they do discuss, such as this distinctions between nation and positive duties, and whether people are involved or involved, etc., that are relevant. So this is another discussion that's been had about whether the two literatures sort of overlap enough that you can kind of learn about self-driving cars by reading philosophy papers and other research about the trolley problem. Okay, so that's the third kind of methodological debate that people have been having. So what should we do with all of this? And it seems to me that there are probably more than 3 options, but here are 3 kind of takeaways that are possible. One would be to say, yes, when we think about self-driving cars, we should really not do anything except for like reading the literature about the trolley problem, because that has all the answers. I think that's probably not going to be correct. Part of this because there are issues clearly that are not discussed. What about risk? What about responsibility, etc.? But what about the other extreme? Saying, for example, like, if you discuss the trolley problem, it would scare people away from self-driving cars. You should never mention anything to do with the trolley problem and think only about other things. But it seems to me that that's probably also not a good idea. Not a good idea, because clearly, again, as Huber and Whiteman have argued, there are some aspects of these discussions that are clearly relevant. So completely ignoring the trolley problem and anything to do with it, that also doesn't seem like a good thing to do. So much better option to me is to say that, well, okay, well, maybe there are some things we can learn about self-driving cars for thinking about the trolley problems. Maybe there are some things we cannot learn. We can think about other things. But in my paper that I based the presentation on, I say that thinking of the trolley problem is either directly relevant because there are certain things that do sort of carry over directly, or it's indirectly relevant because by explaining the differences between crashing self-driving cars and crashing trolleys, that's a way of articulating what we should be thinking about when we think about self-driving cars. So even arguing that there's a relevant difference between the two is sort of instructive because it helps you to clarify why, what you should be focusing the most on. So it seems to me that some people might say, I hate the trolley problem, I don't want anything to do with it, but I want to do research about the ethics of self-driving cars. My message to you then would be that, well, there are so many people who write about this that it actually doesn't matter if what we should do is we should have a sort of division of labor. So some people think about the trolley problem, self-driving cars, some people don't, some people part of it, and then can learn from each other. It's not as if either everyone is doing this comparison or no one's doing it. But in some of the debates, that has been sort of the sense that we have to make a decision about whether we should think about this or not. I say, why don't we just divide up the intellectual labor and have some people working on this, some people not, and then we see what we learn from the overall discussion. Okay, so we've talked about everything from these humorous examples with dogs and others crossing on red lights and green lights, the real world crashes. And the question has been like, do these things have anything to do with each other? We've seen that there's quite a polarized debate. I'm trying to analyze what philosophers talk about, and it seems to me that there are 3 main things. First, is there something ethically insensitive about making a comparison between this sort of funny metaphors and real life issues? Second, are there relevant differences between actual cases involving self-driving cars crashing and sort of scenarios in philosophy and psychology? And third, do the 2 academic literatures like sufficiently overlap with what we're talking about that is sort of instructive to think about what we can learn about real world AI ethics and about this philosophy discussion? And my conclusion has been that, well, there's enough overlap that you can learn something, and even if your main message is that there's important differences, even thinking about that is going to help you to kind of crystallize what does really matter. So it seems to me that it cannot help by being relevant to think about the comparison between crashing self-driving cars and the trolley problem. And so thanks a lot, and let's talk about it.